Let's start with a story. I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s. And when I grew up in the house I grew up in, my family had one telephone. It was yellow, it had a rotary dial, and it was mounted on the wall of my kitchen. Now, I could see there's a number of people in the room know exactly what I'm talking about. Other people are thinking, did I see this in a movie once? Because I'm not sure what he's talking about. Rotary dial, what's that? And we did have concessions to convenience and mobility. I think somewhere along the way, my parents sprung extra for that long coiled cord, so you could actually take the receiver and walk around the corner and sit in the living room for some semblance of privacy. And what's interesting about that, and why I bring it up, is that when the phone rang, one of us would jump up immediately, run to the phone, and we would always answer it on exactly the third ring. Why did we answer it on the third ring? Well, it's because if it went to the fourth ring, we were afraid somebody would hang up, that I wouldn't know who called, what they wanted. Was it an emergency? Did I win a prize? I might miss out. We didn't have caller ID. We didn't have an answering machine. There was no voicemail at the time. And so we had this conditioned response. And I suspect it wasn't just me, it was many of you as well, that when the phone rang, you jumped up, answered it, said hello, who's there? There were exceptions, of course. So sometimes my dad would travel to New York for business, and when he arrived in New York, he would call the house, he would let the phone ring exactly twice, and then hang up. So of course we would never answer on the second ring because it might be my dad calling, and if we picked it up too early, you'd get charged for the long-distance toll charge. Because back then, long-distance cost a lot of money. You'd get this itemized bill, and you're like, oh my God, you talked for 4 minutes. You know, did you see how much money we spent? And so we had these rituals, these little cultural artifacts that no longer exist, but they were very real as we grew up. And that's interesting to think about that, because think of how much has changed in a number of decades in ways that we could have never have imagined. We no longer differentiate between long distance and local calls. I know a lot of people who live here who have area codes from the cities they moved here from because it no longer matters. That's not something we get charged for. I mean, voicemail, that was an innovation at one point, this miraculous thing called voicemail. I was watching a professor, Scott Galloway from NYU, I think Stern School of Business, talk the other day. He said, if there's one thing you want to do in your life to show people you're an old person, is leave them a voicemail. Because no one else leaves voice. My mom leaves me voicemails. That's the only person I know that will leave me a voicemail. So a lot's changed. And nowadays, many of us, especially my kids, don't even use the phone to talk. It's amazing if I could ever get my kids to talk on the phone because they would prefer so many other alternatives. So my thesis for today is that I believe we are in the beginning stages of a digital revolution. And it's going to both enrich our lives in ways that we can't even begin to imagine, but it's also going to create massive disruption across established enterprises, institutions, and entire communities of people who will be severely, severely disrupted as this change occurs. And I believe that our popular press, our media, what we talk about, sometimes misses the mark because we like to talk about what's exciting and new. So we talk about things like big data, data science. We talk about algorithms, and now artificial intelligence is all the rage. We talk about kids going to school and learning these new technologies because I could get rich once I learn how to do this stuff. But I think that there's another aspect to disruptive change beyond the technology that enables the change, and that's not technological in nature, it's cultural in nature. It's what we do in response to the new technology. How do we behave differently? How do we interact differently? And I think that's where some of the interesting change is going to occur, and is already beginning to occur as we speak. So I want to talk about that. And I think that those changes will be both incredibly disruptive, but also wealth building in ways, and I say wealth building in a very kind of twisted sense of the words, wealth building in a way that maybe I can't measure. Not necessarily economic, but in terms of my lifestyle, how I live, joy I get from my life. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I think we can all agree, though, that one of the things that precipitated this change, and it's not an absolute, because a lot of this stuff is great. It's changed over time. We had the internet, we had computers, we had a lot of changes that have occurred in the past few decades. But if there's one event that I would point to, it's 10 years ago this month, Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. So January 9th, 2007, he gets up at Macworld, announces the iPhone. And when he announced it, I don't believe Steve Jobs even knew what the true future potential of this device would be. Because I quote, he said, "I'm introducing a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device." That's what Steve Jobs envisioned when he launched the phone. He was looking to replace the iPod that people were buying, the phone, that brick of a thing we had that flipped open in our pockets, and maybe give you some access to the internet so you could communicate. And one hint to why that was so is that I recently looked at the image of an iPhone from 2007 for a keynote address that I was preparing in Texas. And when I was looking at the image, I saw something was missing. So the phone looked different because it had a chrome bezel. It looked old already. It's hard to say saying that the iPhone looked old, right? But it did, and it had your phone, your Messenger, and your Gmail and Safari. But the one application that was missing from the initial screen was an application store. So that didn't come with the phone. When they introduced it, they were thinking iPod, telephone, communications device, and they would build these applications for this new device. It wasn't until later, on July 10th, 2008, that Apple allowed people to download the App Store and start getting applications on their phone. And that's what really changed everything, because that's when we went from literally a handful of applications to, I think the latest count is over 1 million applications that are available for mobile technology and devices. And so now that we have all these applications out there, the one thing you could say is that they're generating tremendous amounts of data. These applications track where we go, so they provide companies with location services to identify where I am every minute of the day. They can help track what networks of people I interact with on a personal and a professional level. And they can even track my biomechanics, how fast I'm running, how far I'm riding my bicycle, what's my heartbeat, what's my blood pressure at some point. So this is continually evolving, but all these things are throwing off massive amounts of data. And I think when we think about this stuff, it is natural to think about big data. That's such a term that's, I think, overused, but we do have big data. We have analytic tools, algorithms to analyze the big data. And in my profession, we use this all the time. And now advanced intelligence is a way of even doing more with this big data to make it alive and bring benefit to you. But I think the other big element that we have to consider is the network effect, that something's changed when we think about an application. So growing up, if I had an application, I might think of something like Microsoft Word on my computer. It's just me and the application and the computer. Assuming the application works like it's advertised, I do something with it, and then it gives me an output. And I think that was true for the majority of applications, even iTunes when it was first introduced, right? You would use iTunes to play your MP3 files. So it just did something for you. But when we say network effect, what's changed, and we'll give you some examples right now, is that we now are in a situation where the application gains power and relevance because millions of other people are using it as well. And once analysts and data scientists can tap into all that information, what the other millions of users are doing, that opens up a whole new world that is extremely disruptive. So I'll give you 3 examples. So one is what I would call the Spotify model. So this is more from an entertainment view. So we think about streaming music services such as Spotify, Pandora, or Apple Music, and it would be justifiable to think of them as a replacement for records, for CDs, for MP3 files. So now I just have all this data and it's streaming to me, so it's a cheaper replacement. And recently Dan Chiasson was writing in the New York Review of Books, and he stated, "This is a new world. Cloud streaming represents a bigger revolution than one brought on by CDs, MP3s, which made music merely cheaper to buy and easier to carry around. Then a person with $10 to spend could have purchased an album. Now, with $10, that same person can subscribe to a streaming service for a month and not only hear that album, but also about 20 million other songs, assuming you have time." So instead of just carrying around or replacing bulky MP3s, what the streaming service has done have given us greater availability of variety. And there's a whole other debate about temporality, that once music was tied to what was common at the time, what I would hear on the radio. Now I could listen to whatever I want. So if I remember that great James Brown song when I was driving home with my dad in 1975, I could bring that up in a heartbeat. And so it's blasting away previous ideas of what we thought were barriers to how music interacted with our lives. But the bigger thing is that what Spotify has done that's really brilliant lately is they've really cracked the code on taking data analytics, understanding what consumers are doing with the data, what songs they're listening to, overlaying that with demographics and other life segment analytics, and then figuring out what is your best curated playlist. And they're getting better and better at this. They recently rolled out Spotify Discover, which every week gives you a curated playlist based on what you've listened to in the past, but then they can seed in songs based on what other listeners like you have listened to and enjoyed listening to. And typically the reaction is, if they get it right. Now, they didn't always get it right initially, but once they figured it out and got the algorithms tuned, you'd be listening to this playlist, you'd hear a brand new song you'd never heard before, and your first reaction would be, wow, this is a great song. I love it. What is this? I don't even know these guys. And so it's a sign of how good they're getting at understanding our own needs through this crowdsourced data analytics perspective. And I have to ask the question is this a form of wealth for us as consumers that's very difficult to measure? Because it certainly does increase our satisfaction. You know, our day-to-day life, walking around is now given to a soundtrack that's customized for us. The other model I'll briefly mention is Uber, which we've also mentioned throughout the conference. I'm amazed to hear, I recently read Uber launched their first smartphone app in 2010, Uber Cab. Today, the company is valued at $70 billion. It's startling that they could grow that fast in 5 or 6 years. And Uber, in my opinion, is the ultimate solution of sort of the cloud, the ether, right? They don't own any cars. They don't really have that many employees. I think their employee count's around 4,000 and growing, but considering the valuation and revenue of the company, that's a drop in the bucket compared to traditional firms like Hewlett-Packard or Macy's or other large firms that employ hundreds of thousands of people. But what have they done? They've completely changed how we think about transportation. And now they're really focusing on self-driving cars and using advanced intelligence to even replace the driver of the car. And the real reason they're trying to do that is if they can push down the cost per mile of an Uber service to the point where that cost per mile is cheaper than any of us actually owning a car, what incentive do you have to do to drive? Now, there's actually some social good that could come out of that, because they could bring driving ability and mobility to disadvantaged communities who can prior times not afford it, people who have the inability to drive, whether legally or physically. I mean, it does open up a lot of possibilities. But it's also going to be very disruptive, because it can completely change the auto industry as we know it. And I could go on for hours talking about what electrification is about to do to the auto industry, especially in Europe, where we have huge machining unions, but that's another story. But all this is based on data and technology and apps, but the ultimate effect is to change how we behave as consumers. Because I've already had a number of examples where I never would have taken a cab, but now that I had Uber on my phone, I said, oh, I'll see if an Uber is available, and I'll take that instead. So it's really opened up potential, and I think there might be a social good as well. Potentially has also reduced drunk driving deaths, because quickly people will realize I could now have an option to get home safely because I'll just take the Uber instead of driving. Time saved. I don't have to find parking. Yesterday morning, I knew my wife was joining us at the Mass, so I just took an Uber up here. I didn't have to worry about driving around the block looking for a parking spot. And when you guys were trying to move your cars, I was sitting in here having a coffee. It was great. So there are some indirect advantages. And then the third model I'd like to touch on briefly is Amazon. I recently looked back at my purchase history at Amazon, which was really interesting, because I didn't know you could do this until my daughter told me about it. But you could actually go in and year by year see all the things that you bought on Amazon. So I said, well, let's go all the way back and see what happened. My very first purchase was in 1998. I bought a book. It's called the New Jerome Biblical Commentary. And I purchased that book because I had just started my program here at DSPT. And that year I bought 2 books. I bought that book and I bought another book at Christmas time. But later, something a little bit more portentous happened. In 2002 or 2003, I noticed I bought a toaster. And if you think about what that means, I bought a toaster. Well, it's not just me buying a toaster. It's a lot of people like me buying toasters and appliances on Amazon. And then you look at the current day's news stories. Sears Roebuck Company is a company that I loved going shopping to growing up. They are just dying for air right now, and everyone's waiting, when do they file for bankruptcy? They're on the last legs. Macy's is announcing major layoffs, right? But when people like me started buying toasters on Amazon, how many trips to Macy's never occurred ever again, right? Why would you, when you could just get it online and then with Amazon Prime have it at your doorstep in 2 days for no shipping cost? So we're talking about massive changes in commerce, and it's going to have a big effect. Now, this accelerates with digital technology and our phones in our pockets. So in 2013, my family and I moved to Upper Rockridge here in Oakland, close by. And one day, my kids and I were walking down to a local store called the Village Market, which is, it's a kind of an expensive grocery store, but it's one of those places where it's expensive, but it's a lot easier to get in and out of. So if I want to make a quick trip, I'm going to go there, pay the price, because I'll get home quickly. And on the way out, I noticed this little magazine rack and had a book about my neighborhood called Rockridge. I thought, oh, that sounds really cool. I want to check this book out. So I picked it up, flipped through it. I've got to buy this book. It was $19.99. So I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I don't think I'd ever done this before. I opened the Amazon app that was already on my phone. I typed in the name of the book, and it said you could buy it used for $3.99, and the shipping is free because it's Prime. I hit one click right there as I was looking at the book on the shelf, and 2 days later, it's on my front doorstep. So that local merchant lost that sale, but essentially forever, right? Because I don't need to pay full price if there's this very transparent marketplace out there that allows me access to goods and services. And again, we're seeing that with the news we're seeing in grocery retailing, in durable goods retailing, across the board. Major companies that employ hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people as checkout clerks, stockers, salespersons on the floor, they're all getting hit hard by these massive transformations that are occurring. And I wonder, are these good or bad? Because clearly for me and people like all of us in the room that use these services, they're great because we save money, they're more efficient, I don't have to travel to get my stuff, but at the same time they are very disruptive to large segments of the population. And I also think that things like Amazon have an impact on how we view markets. So, what was once a mass market opportunity for big companies like Procter & Gamble or any of the large companies that sell goods across the country through mass market TV advertising, that's gone because now any firm could come up with a new idea that benefits what you want and other people like you want and market it and distribute it very efficiently through these online channels. That's an existential threat to large companies that produce these products as well. But I want to take it one step further and say, I've kind of talked a little bit about two layers of abstraction here. We got the hardware, right? And that's kind of what we talk about, like, oh, my kids are always on the iPhone, right? And we kind of get seduced by the bright, shiny object. I want the latest upgrade. And we talk about the hardware, but the hardware is only the physical carrier of the applications. So you could also argue that if we take it to that one next level of abstraction and talk about the applications, that's where the real magic happens, right? Because once Apple created this platform, this computing environment, you could start creating these applications that allow people to do things that we literally never could do before. Think of online banking. I can't remember the last time I went to a bank to deposit a check because I could just take a picture of it and I'm done. So things are changing very quickly, but I would also suggest that if we look at those examples like Spotify, Uber, and Amazon, the applications themselves and the platforms they're on, they're transferable too, because it doesn't matter if I'm on Apple's iOS or if I'm on the Android platform and have an LG smartphone. They all still interact, and so what's really going on, I'm thinking about, is what's this process that's changing underneath all of that? What is the new way of doing things that these applications are encoding for us that are affecting us as a society and how we interact with each other? And I think that's where we're going to really see some interesting behavior changes occurring. I purposely spoke about the value or wealth created by these services because it's something that I just started thinking about, and I think it's very hard to quantify. But that's not usually where the conversation begins. We talk about how these disrupt existing enterprises, how many stores selling records or CDs still exist, how many blockbusters still exist once Netflix was introduced. They don't. And I predict that once the technology is fully sorted out, if we take one market, for example, long-distance trucking, long-distance trucking, I believe, will flip to computer-driven fleets of trucks faster than anyone can anticipate. I think Uber recently purchased Otto, the company that's investigating how to automate truck driving. And the economics are just too strong because truck driving is a high liability business. You're driving long hours, slippery roads, you get in crashes. They always need more efficiency. They want to keep those trucks moving. If they're parked in a rest stop to get a government-mandated night's rest, they're not earning any money. And so by getting rid of regulatory restraints, risk, and increasing efficiency, I think we're going to see a situation in the next decade where potentially 3.5 million truck drivers are out of work. And what effect is that going to have on us as a culture, as a society, and as an economy? And I think there's other things around that, right? Like there's 5 million people that support those truck driving routes. That could be automated in software. So what happens when they lose their jobs? And the ironic thing is that Amazon, I think just the other week, announced they're going to add 100,000 jobs Amazon's going to hire for. And I think there's more than a few people that said that was a little bit opportunistically timed given the new administration and the criticism. But the real question is if Amazon's announcing they're adding 100,000 new jobs, how many hundred thousands of jobs will be eliminated by those new employees? Is it going to be 500,000? Is it going to be 1 million? 2 million? I wouldn't be surprised if any of those estimates have a grain of truth, given that their platform is so efficient compared to our traditional brick and mortar way of delivering goods and services to consumers. So, from my perspective, I've spent the majority of my professional life working in the market research business. One consistent goal, going all the way back to the 1990s, has been trying to move our industry from reporting about what is, observations about what is occurring, to what ought to be done, because that's where the value is, insight. That's always been our goal. Whether I've been running a software design team, working in an advanced and analytic consulting group, or running a large client relationship, we always wanted to move the needle from a commodity, information, to stuff that helps you make decisions, Mr. Businessman, so you can make better decisions and make more money. And as we think about that, working with that data, an example would be price elasticity. I could calculate the price elasticity of an item, and then I could encode that in software so that based on the situation around me, what my competitors are doing, I could automatically tell a client, do I raise or lower the price in order to maximize the sales of my product? Now, I can report that in the past few years, the research industry as a whole has had enormous success in encoding our algorithms into software, building applications that figure this stuff out for our clients, and creating automated systems that make sense of vast treasure troves of data and tell our clients what to do. However, the success is bittersweet. Once the machines were turned on, many of the skilled knowledge workers, even in my own company, that provided insights, discovered that they too had become expendable. Once the machines were turned on and the software started making the decisions, then the highly paid employees who once sifted through all that data became one more cost center that could be optimized, and they too are being eliminated at this very point in time. And once the clients installed the software that helped them optimize their process flow, their supply chain, they too started to see that they could streamline processes and get rid of highly paid white-collar employees. So I thought it was interesting that our discussion yesterday, a lot of people think about the effect of technology as hitting the truck drivers of the world, the hourly employees, but it's not stopping there. It's also hitting the people who are white-collar workers in Fortune 500 companies, and that's happening right now. I've seen it start over the past year and accelerate, so who knows where it's going. So one of my research interests is to look at past changes in information technology for clues to our current situation. I mean, we could talk about the printing revolution, that's the easy one, right? And other people have talked about various changes in industrialization over the past 2 centuries. But I have an intuition, it's a scary intuition, but I have an intuition that as much as we can learn from history in this regard, the changes are going to be much greater and have much more disruptive impact on our society than even our history will inform us about. So we're heading into a whole new world. In an essay entitled In the Depths of the Digital Age, Edward Mendelsohn wrote, "Every technology revolution coincides with changes in what it means to be a human being. In the kinds of psychological borders that divide the inner life from the world outside, the digital revolution suddenly increased the rate and scale of change in almost everyone's lives." Now, I think what he says might be a little bit hyperbolic. From a Christian perspective, I would argue that our humanness is much more consistent than he would claim. But it does go on to illuminate that the dimensions and the magnitude of the disruptions we are about to face, what we've seen in the past 5 years, 10 years is only the beginning, and it's going to accelerate, and we won't have any easy answers. So yesterday, Agnieszka spoke about information versus knowledge versus wisdom, and I thought that was a really nice hierarchy because it fits so well with the topics I'd intended to speak about. And yes, we can build the tools to collect, store, analyze vast stores of data, but the hurdle of wisdom is not so easily overcome. We have the tools to precisely target advertisements for sugar-coated snacks to households with children. That's an easily solved technical problem. It helps just magnify the business decisions for companies that sell those products. But the data cannot answer, the algorithms cannot answer, is that an ethical thing to do? So as we move forward, I think we'll have to really start to understand is how do we as a society and via our government respond to treat disrupted groups of workers in a human way with compassion and sensitivity. Take, for example, the trucking jobs. Are we up to the task of wondering how to help them pay their bills when their jobs disappear? Or will our government's answer be, or society's answer be, just work harder because you should be a self-made man? I don't think that solution is going to solve the problem. And we have to be on guard against demoralizing and corrosive messages from our culture, whether it's a gospel of prosperity, or as other commentators have spoken about today, fringe free market thinking that will do nothing to solve for large swaths of the population that are being disrupted and have no clue as to what to do next, considering that's been their entire life. Arthur C. Clarke said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And for all the capabilities our technology brings, it would be reasonable to assume that human-centered questions of meaning, morality, and purpose have not gone away. I believe, as I expect you do too, the Catholic imagination, our broad witness and experience across the world, and our rich tradition of philosophical and theological engagement uniquely prepares us as leaders to identify emerging issues of critical import and formulate answers that will help us as a society to responsibly both benefit from this new technology, as we will, but also support those whose lives have been disruptive. And all I would leave us with is the thought that the complexity is deeper than I think any of us imagine, especially reading the popular press about what's going on. And I think the urgency is greater than we can ever imagine. Once these changes hit, and I predict in the next 5 to 8 years, we're going to see them hitting faster and harder than we ever thought, there will be a great deal of urgency to create solutions, and it will be upon us to lead the way in terms of providing guidance to help our policymakers make the best decisions. So thank you.